everyone, and welcome to the 21st installation of the Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture. I am Aaliyah Williams, and I am honored to serve as your moderator for this evening's lecture under the theme, The Radar Request, Sovereignty and Vulnerability of the Caribbean. Tonight, we reflect on issues that sit at the very heart of regional governance, national security, and our regional identity. This evening's feature address will be delivered by Professor Griffith, and I can assure you that it will be an intellectually fulfilling and engaging event. So please join me in welcoming Justice Alvin Pariak Singh, High Court Judge, Senator the Honorable Dr. Decima Williams, President of the Senate, the Honorable Claudette Joseph, Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Labor and Consumer Affairs, Chief Magistrate, Ms. Francine Foster, Ms. Kina Marast, Magistrate, Mr. Peter David, Member of Parliament, Professor Griffith, our featured speaker, Mr. Christopher Nelson, Director of Public Prosecutions, Ms. Deborah St. Bernard, Chairman of the Public Service Commission, and Mr. Francis Paul, President of the Grenada Bar Association. I also welcome you, our audience, in person and our online viewers to this evening's event. Before we begin, I have 3 quick house announcements. So we do ask that all persons put your phone either on silent or you can switch it off to avoid any interruption during this session. The bathrooms are located to the left of the exit doors, so the exits are on my right. Once you exit the doors, you walk straight down to the left and you'll see the bathrooms. And lastly, the live stream is being live streamed on YouTube, so for persons who are unable to make it, you can send them the link. To lead us off into this evening's proceedings, we invite Ms. Letitia Andrews for our opening prayer. Please stand.
Good evening, everyone. Please bow your heads and close your eyes. Heavenly Father, we give you praise and we give you thanks because this is a day that you have made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Father, we invite your presence into this room as we open our minds to learn, to understand, God, to even ask questions. We pray, oh God, that your presence would remain with us, that you would hasten the footsteps and the wheels of those who are coming and those who are watching online, that God, they would also be able to be a part of this amazing presentation. Father, we say thank you for this evening. We say thank you for this evening's presentation and its proceedings. And we pray, oh God, that you would continue to be with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Now, please remain standing as we invite Mr. Trevor St. Bernard for a rendition of the National Anthem of Grenada.
Hail Grenada, land of ours, we pledge ourselves to thee. Heads, hearts, and hands in unity to reach our destiny. Ever conscious of God, being proud of our heritage, may we with faith and courage aspire, build, advance as one people, one family. God bless our nation.
Thank you, Mr. St. Bernard and Ms. Andrews. Please be seated. The Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture has always pushed us toward deeper reflection. It gives us the space to confront issues of national, regional, and international importance. The thrust behind this lecture, in consideration of Sir Archibald NEDD's strive for education, knowledge, and information, aims to provide public education. This lecture remains the annual premier event of the Grenada Bar Association and is now being conducted in one of our sister isles in Kitts. We continue with a drive to spread its influence across the Caribbean. I now invite Ms. Dia C. Forrester, former Attorney General and former acting High Court Judge, to share the biography of Sir Archibald NEDD, our honoree.
Good evening, everyone, and compliments of the season to each of you. As this annual lecture is named after Sir Archibald NEDD, it is always fitting for us to share snippets of his life in his memory. Sir Archibald NEDD was born on the 8th day of August, 1916, in the island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He attended primary school and secondary school in Grenada, where he excelled tremendously and was named as Grenada's 1934 Island Scholar. Sir Archibald NEDD obtained a Bachelor of Laws degree in 1938 from King's College in London, and in November of that year, he was called to the bar as a member of the Honorable Society of the Inner Temple. During his legal career, Sir Archibald NEDD served in several countries in various legal capacities. In 1939, he entered private practice in Grenada until 1940, when he was appointed as the Registrar of the High Court and Additional Magistrate in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. From 1941 to 1943, he served as Registrar and Additional Magistrate in Dominica. From 1943 to 1944, he was based in St. Lucia as a magistrate and also acted there as Attorney General, a position that was then known in colonies as Crown Attorney. Between 1944 to 1949, he served as Crown Attorney in Dominica. In 1949, Sir Archibald NEDD moved to the African continent, specifically the country of Nigeria, where he's said to have spent the next 25 years of his life. In Nigeria, Sir NEDD firstly served as magistrate from 1949 to 1953. From 1953 to 1970, he was engaged in private practice until 1974, when he served as State Counsel and legal draftsman in the government of Nigeria. In 1974, Sir Archibald NEDD returned to the Caribbean and was appointed a puisne judge of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court. He commenced his tenure as a judge in Antigua, where he served for 1 year until he was assigned to Grenada from 1975 to 1979. On the removal of Grenada from the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court in 1979 and the establishing of the Supreme Court of Grenada under the People's Laws during the Grenada Revolution, Sir Archibald NEDD was appointed to the position of Chief Justice of that new court in Grenada. He served in that capacity until 1986, when he retired from judicial office. We appreciate his juristic contribution, and one notes in particular his scholarship on the doctrine of necessity. Prior to his retirement, specifically in 1984, Sir Archibald NEDD was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen of England. After retirement, Sir NEDD notably was asked to lead an investigation into Antigua's and Barbuda's runway scandal in 1987. After a fulsome life in the law, Sir Archibald NEDD passed away on the 20th day of June, 1992, after a long illness at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Barbados. The Sir Archibald NEDD lecture series was launched in his memory by the Grenada Bar Association in July of 1996. The first lecture was delivered by the late Dr. Joseph Archibald, Queen's Counsel and then President of the OACS Bar Association. Today, we are having the 21st lecture delivered, a feat the Grenada Bar Association continues to celebrate, as this is one of the longest running lecture series among the 56 nations in the Commonwealth. Thank you for joining us today. We do hope that you find today's lecture insightful.
Thank you, Ms. Forrester. I now invite President of the Grenada Bar Association, Mr. Francis K. Paul, to issue a few remarks.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and good evening to all. Please allow me to adopt the protocol already set by the moderator to be safe. On behalf of the Grenada Bar Association, I'd like to welcome all friends, colleagues, special invited guests, visitors, persons attending physically here and virtually via the Zoom platform and also watching the live stream on YouTube. Welcome to the 21st Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture. I was so excited to get here on time this evening that I forgot my glasses, amongst other things. So you might see me peering and I might have to wing it a bit. But for 21 years, as my colleague dear Forrester has said, the Grenada Bar Association has maintained this premier forum for justice and legal education, not only for audiences in Grenada, but across the Commonwealth. Now, Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture is usually a standalone public education activity due to its importance. However, this year, because of time constraints, we are proud to host the lecture during our Law Week activities, which commence on Sunday. So let me also take the opportunity to welcome you to our Law Week 2025. We commence this week's activities under the theme, Renewing Our Commitment to Justice, a time of reflection and service. And this theme is not mere words, but encourages us to reaffirm our dedication to justice, equality, and the rule of law, reflect on the evolving legal landscape, make recommendations for reform, and serve the community through public legal education and pro bono work. We started this week's activity by attending Mass at the Catholic Church of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, situated at Cali St. George. Yesterday, we had our media day and school visits where we engaged students from 6 secondary schools in the St. George Parish and 1 secondary school in the parish of St. Andrew. We spoke on conflict resolution, tested their knowledge on law, and give advice on law as a career. Today, we have this lecture. Tomorrow, we have prison and police station visits. And with the prison visits, annually, we would make donation of toiletries, clothing, as well as stationery and other supplies to assist the inmates who attend the school there. Thursday, we have a mock criminal trial, and the court will be set up as an actual high court, sitting in its criminal jurisdiction and presided over by one of our resident high court judges. And Friday, we again giving back to the public by giving free legal advice. But right now, we are now fulfilling our public legal education mandate with this very distinguished law lecture series. The 21st Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture, as my colleague Dia indicated, hold the record of the longest running lecture series in the Commonwealth. And for that, we are extremely proud. We hold this lecture series in honor of a legal luminary who served with distinction. Sir Archibald NEDD was a renowned scholar and our former Chief Justice from 1979 to 86. This lecture series is his lasting legacy, and it aims to empower citizens by increasing awareness, promoting understanding, and fostering engagement, which ultimately leads citizens to making informed decisions and protection of their rights. The inaugural series was delivered by Dr. Joseph Archibald of blessed memory, and past lectures have spanned several critical areas, including constitutional law, human rights, criminal libel, sentencing, and the Caribbean Courts of Justice. The lectures have been delivered by eminent jurists, including Chief Justices, distinguished and prominent guest speakers, including past and present prime ministers, and erudite scholars. Over the last 3 years, the 18th lecture was presented by Dame Janice Pereira, then Chief Justice of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court. The 19th lecture was presented by our own Prime Minister, the Honorable Deacon Mitchell. And last year, the existential threat of climate change was addressed by Dr. Lena Spencer Thomas on the non-law related topic, climate change and the environment, will small island states survive? And this topic was chosen after observing the rise in daily temperature, devastating flash floods, the passage of Hurricane Beryl, and the effect that it had on Carriacou, Petit Martinique, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. We as a bar had to provide a forum to sensitize the public of the threats of climate change on our small developing states. This year's topic speaks to the very heart of our identities as Caribbean nations. The reader requests: sovereignty and vulnerability in the Caribbean. And this topic was chosen based on the request made by the United States of America to Grenada in August of 2025 to install a radar station at the Maurice Bishop International Airport. This request created quite a chatter and stir across our parishes. The questions raised include: is the intended deployment of foreign military-linked equipment on Grenadian soil a security measure or to help fight the war on drugs? Or has been questioned by some, is it an infringement on Grenada's sovereignty and integrity? Does, according to the request, place Grenada into the complex geopolitical rivalry between the USA and Venezuela, thereby placing a bullseye on Grenada, a small state without a defense force? What are the safety and technical issues associated with installing a radar station at a civilian airport? The declaration that the Caribbean is a zone of peace has therefore become the chorus since the USA commenced operations against alleged drug traffickers in international waters close to Venezuela. Consequently, our economy, which is heavily dependent on tourism, is at risk, as folks converse about the threat of military action with Venezuela and the risk that the installation of military equipment can pose to Grenada and the other Caribbean states as safe tourist destinations. In the wider region, Grenada's decision would set a precedent for how small, economically vulnerable states navigate the geopolitical interests of powerful states. As a bar, we found the duty bound to assist the public in answering those questions and addressing their concerns. This is why this year's lecture will be delivered by Professor Ivla Griffith, a Caribbean man, a renowned scholar and author who has published widely on Caribbean and hemispheric affairs, a visiting scholar at Military Institute in the United States, Canada, and Germany, making him uniquely qualified to address this topic. Now, before I conclude, I want to assure the public that the Grenada Bar Association will continue to discharge its duties by providing public education on legal issues and current legislation. Upon reflecting during our law week thus far, and from conversations, we recognize that we need to have more frequent engagement with the public to sensitize and answer what can be considered as simple legal questions or issues We promise to have these engagements in the near future. Now we are here not just to listen, but to learn and engage. I encourage you to participate fully in the discourse to follow. Once again, I welcome you all to what promises to be a very interactive and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. We recognize the work of the Grenada Bar Association again during this year's Law Week. And of course, we'd like to extend our thanks to the executive membership of the Bar Association in organizing this evening's events and ensuring that the bar fulfills its obligations to our community through events as this one. So as Mr. Paul would have mentioned, we had our school visits this week, and I actually attended one of those visits. And I must say, of course, because of my own bias, I expected everyone there to say that they wanted to be a lawyer or an attorney. But although that was not the response that I got, I must say that Grenada is heading in a very positive direction. A lot of the students expressed interest in areas like diplomacy, data protection, and areas of engineering that I cannot remember because I did not know that it existed. Now, just a light joke. Usually I refer to myself as a Grenadian. I've been living here 2 years, so I think that that is a sufficient period, right? And my friends will always laugh and say, I abandoned my island, which is Trinidad and Tobago. But I tell them, no, I am a Caribbean citizen. And I think that that is such an important statement, especially tying into tonight's lecture. Any matter, any issue that affects one island definitely affects the Caribbean as an entire region, and it is important to ensure that we are educated, informed, and that we lend support to our sister isles where need be. So I will now invite Mr. Kadeem Strawn to do the introduction of our featured speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. That's better. Professor Ivor Griffith. Professor Griffith is a fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and a former senior associate of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He originated the concept geonarcotics in the early 1990s as a way to study the complex relationship involving drugs, geography, power, and politics, outlining it first in the International Journal, Canada's leading international affairs scholarly magazine. The concept was then applied empirically to study the Caribbean in the 1997 book, Drugs and Security in the Caribbean. In 2024, he introduced the concept of challenged sovereignty, which describes circumstances where the vulnerability of states is worsened by internal or external developments that compromise the ability of their leaders to design and deliver domestic and foreign policy independently. Dr. Griffith has published widely on Caribbean and hemispheric affairs, including 11 books, most recently, Challenged Sovereignty, Oil and Climate Change in the Guyana-Suriname Petropower Basin, Sylvie's Love and Loss, and Oil and Climate Change in Guyana's Wet Neighborhood. Also, his more than 60 academic and policy articles have appeared in numerous prestigious publications, and he has been featured in several podcasts. He is the recipient of the 2015 Perry Award for Excellence in Security and Defense Education, named in honor of former U.S. Defense Secretary Dr. William J. Perry, the first person from the Caribbean to receive this honor. Moreover, in 2017, he was awarded Guyana's Cacique Crown of Honor, the country's third highest national honor for excellence in international scholarship and transformational education leadership. Professor Griffith has served in several academic leadership roles, including as Vice Chancellor of the University of Guyana, President of Fort Valley State University in Georgia, Provost of Radford University in Virginia, and of York College, the City University of New York, and also as a Dean at the Florida International University. Moreover, he has testified before the U.S. Congress on Caribbean security issues, and he has served as a consultant to several international organizations. A past president of the Caribbean Studies Association, Dr. Griffith also has been a visiting scholar at military institutes in Canada, Germany, and the United States. A member of the Rotary Club of Freeport Merrick in New York, Dr. Griffith has been a long-standing member of the historic St. George's Episcopal Church, where he serves on the vestry or governing board and heads the stewardship committee. He has been blessed to have had Francine as his loving partner for just over 4 decades, and together they have 2 children and 2 grandchildren. Ladies and gentlemen, your distinguished speaker for tonight, Professor Ivelaw Griffith.
Can you hear me? Let's give Professor Griffith a better round of applause. Come on now. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. I want to stand on the protocol already established. Allow me to begin by thanking the distinguished gentleman for the invitation and the introduction. It's not very often that you have an organization that sustains a valuable practice for 26 years. A round of applause to the Grenada Bar Association. And it's always useful, I think, in my humble view, to identify the individuals who started that journey. And although Mr. Ruggles Ferguson is not here tonight, I want to give him a shout out and encourage you to recognize him as one of the starters of this journey. I'm always delighted to come back to Grenada. As a matter of fact, a friend from way back was pulling my leg earlier, saying to me that she saw on Facebook that this is my 3rd visit for this year to Grenada. It is. Francine and I came in March because I took a different journey in writing and I published my first novel. You're asking, what's this novel? I'll tell you about it, and I'll encourage you to buy a copy. But I'll tell you a secret. The president of the Bar Association promised to buy a copy for every member of the executive. So hold him to that. That is this Christmas gift to you. This novel, Sylvie's Love and Loss, deals with Grenada. And thanks to the generosity and organizational skill of a good friend, Dr. Wendy Grenada from SGU, we had a wonderful book launch in March. You can still get it at your bookstores, and if they don't have it, go to Amazon. The book deals not with my wife. Who is this? Sylvie is not my wife. But Sylvie is a personality who I met in Grenada 27 years ago as I was doing research on another book. And I had such a revealing experience with that encounter, I said, when I retire, I have to write a novel. This is that novel in it. And when I came in March for the book launch, I ran into a friend who I hadn't seen for many years. She's a good dance partner. She happens to be the president of your Senate. Hadn't seen Decima in many, many moons. But that visit in March also allowed me to reconnect with another friend who I hadn't seen for 31 years. He tried to hide and come back to Grenada. His name is Dr. Ezra. He's right there trying to hide away. I hadn't seen Ezra in 31 years. And then 2 months ago, we came and we spent a wonderful week at the Sandals. This is a third visit, and as I said in Facebook, maybe I should get a Grenadian passport. I've been here so many, so many times, but for 1 year. I had the pleasure about a decade and a half ago of delivering the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture at Florida International University. And that lecture was so well received, people said, you've got to publish it. And I decided that since the lecture was too long to publish as a paper in a journal, I'm going to develop a book out of it. This book, Challenge Sovereignty, published last year, came out of that Eric Williams Memorial Lecture. So guess what's going to happen after this lecture? Maybe the GBA will invite me for a launch of that book once it is published. The issues we're going to be talking about and have been talking about for the last number of weeks are so significant. We need to capture them in policy and academic and literary works, not only for the contemporary society's participants, but for posterity. And so I've committed myself, I'm sure my wife and granddaughter will not be happy, that I'm allegedly in retirement and I'm writing more books. Let me address a curiosity which I think many people would have. Why is this lecture not following the conventional lecturer speaking from the podium? When Ruggles first approached me, I said to him, I want to do something different. I want to facilitate a conversation and use images because the kind of subject that we're going to be talking about is best engaged with pictures and videos. And so what we're going to be having is not simply a conventional lecture with my standing there, but I want to move around and have you see things that help you to retain and serve as a basis for the conversations that you will have with others as we move beyond this evening. About 5.5 decades ago, when I was in high school, one of my teachers introduced me to a gentleman in one of my mathematics classes. I had a teacher who taught Latin and math, and one of the mathematicians we talked about was a gentleman called Bertrand Russell. It turned out, I didn't realize until we went to university, that Bertrand Russell was not simply a mathematician. He was also a philosopher. He was also, in the context of one of those Renaissance men, a literary scholar. Matter of fact, his Nobel Prize was the one for literature. And for several decades now, I've embraced a proposition by Russell insofar as conversations like this. And this is what Bertrand Russell said that I've embraced over the last 5-6 decades. He said, sometimes it's a healthy thing now and then to hang a question mark on things you long take for granted. I want to embrace Russell and recommend that there are 3 useful question marks we might hang on the conversation about the radar, conversation about sovereignty, conversation about vulnerability. Mr. David is wondering, well, what are these question marks? Grenada, individually, the Caribbean writ large, are not islands unto ourselves. And it's important in talking about issues related to Grenada or any Caribbean society individually or collectively, we put the conversation in context. And I think I'd like to hang the first question mark on that context by asking, what are some relevant local, global, contextual factors we need to keep in mind as we talk about the radar, vulnerability, and sovereignty. So we'll spend a few minutes, maybe 5 or 6 Guyanese minutes, which is like 12, 13 regular minutes. I don't know how much that is in Grenadian minutes, maybe 15, Anand? Maybe 15. And then we'll go on to the second question. What are some contemporary geopolitical realities that dramatize Grenada's vulnerability? Moving from the context to understanding content, we hang a question mark on content, grappling with contemporary geopolitical realities. But, ladies and gentlemen, we know that the Grenada radar request is not only about Grenada. And so we have to ask the question, what are some region-wide implications? What are some region-wide ironies? That is the approach, mindful of Bertrand Russell's admonition, that is the approach I recommend we embrace in having this conversation. One of my favorite Enlightenment philosophers is a gentleman called François-Marie Arouet. He was popularly known as Voltaire. Voltaire had a penchant for asking people to clarify, define. He would drive his colleagues crazy by saying, "If you wish to converse with me, monsieur, define your terms. Define your terms." And so I want to recommend that it's important, since this conversation is going to be about vulnerability and about sovereignty, that those two terms are going to be like a fulcrum around which we wrap our conversation. It's useful to define what we mean by sovereignty. It's useful to define what we mean by vulnerability. Now, you don't have to be an international relations professor or an international relations and international legal scholar to know that the concept of sovereignty dates back since all the way to 1648. Came out of a conflict that was resolved in Westphalia. But over the years, the notion of sovereignty has gone through shifts and changes. It initially was seen as a relationship involving states between and among each other at the international level. But it has evolved over time, contentious in the discourse. And so when I was writing that book to which I referred, Challenge Sovereignty, I thought it necessary to give my own operational definition of what sovereignty is. And so for me, sovereignty has to do with the following. It's the supreme authority of any state over itself without interference from foreign entities, unless expressly permitted by the state's authorized officials, authority that secures the territory, the citizens, and possesses the economic, technical, military, and other capabilities to promulgate domestic and foreign policy. So for me, sovereignty is not only about international matters, it's also about domestic matters. Do you have the ability to promulgate policy and execute it? Sovereignty for me is both international and domestic. Mindful of Voltaire, defining our terms. But we also said a few minutes ago that the fulcrum around which this conversation will be wrapped is not only one related to sovereignty. The fulcrum is also one that has to do with vulnerability. And so similarly, I thought it would be useful to put on the table the definitional parameters of what I mean by vulnerability. And so in that very book, for me, Vulnerability arises where the geographic, political, economic, or other factors cause a nation's security to be compromised. Usually it's not a function of one factor. Vulnerability involves very often combination of factors that can reduce or remove the state's influence or power, opening it up to internal or external incursion, among other things. Over the years, I've used a formulation by a former Prime Minister, Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford. He was speaking at the CARICOM Summit in 1990, and in his statement, he laid out a formulation that I said is a wonderful way of extending that definition of vulnerability to see what are its component parts. And this is what Sir Lloyd said. Vulnerability to the Caribbean is a manifold vulnerability. We are subject to hurricanes and earthquakes, are we not? Our market conditions are dependent on decisions taken economically elsewhere. The cultural penetration that we all know well about. We're also vulnerable to the machinations of terrorists. And you didn't have to be living through Beryl in Grenada or any place else last year to understand the manifold nature of vulnerability, the environmental element of vulnerability. And for those people who think that climate change is fake news, let them go to Jamaica, or the Bahamas, or Cuba, or Dominican Republic. Let them see the ravages of Hurricane Melissa that has left over 100 people dead among those islands, that have led to damage close to $9 billion in Jamaica alone. Vulnerability is manifold. So I think having clarified those terms, reminding ourselves of what Voltaire often said, define your terms, I think it's useful now to go to the first question. And as a reminder, the first question has to do with context. We'll spend a minute or two talking about global context, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the local, regional things that have got to be taken into consideration when we think of this radar. The radar issue is not just about the radar. Grenada is not just about Grenada. Context matters. We all know that this international community has a number of constituent parts. There are states or nations or countries in subregions like the Eastern Caribbean, in regions like the Caribbean or Central America, that are part of hemispheres, all of which connected to this global international order. But the connectivity is not only theoretical. You know, there was a calypso way back in the 80s or 90s about the neck bone connecting to the head bone, connecting to the bones of the world are connected too. And you don't have to be in a part of the world to feel the effects of the connection. It used to be a popular saying, when the United States sneezes, the Caribbean catches a cold. Sometimes it's not an ordinary cold, it's a flu. The connectivity of the world is such that you may not know about a development, you may not have known about another part of the world. Things in that part of the world can affect you. And as I thought of what is a real contemporary reality with the connectivity that you might appreciate, I thought of two W words: war and wheat. I'm going to bet you $100. You choose if it's EC or US. of the president to the Senate's money, that many Grenadians may not have heard of the country called Ukraine before 2022. But something happened in Ukraine in 2022 that affected all of us, whether we know it or not. And you get a sense of it when you realize what the reality of that war and wheat connection is. Ukraine and Russia combined produce a significant amount of the world's wheat and barley and grain and sorghum. Ukraine produces a significant proportion of the world's fertilizers. So once that war broke out, you may not understand why the price of your bread may have risen. You may not have understood why the cost of certain drug provisions may have gone up. The fertilizers used had to be factored into the price. You may not have heard of Ukraine, but what happened in Ukraine affected us all. Now, it happens that the Caribbean and Latin America are not significant importers of wheat, sorghum, and barley from Ukraine and Russia. But those prices affect the world market and the world supply chain. And if there's a shortage in Europe, it's going to affect the availability in Latin America and the Caribbean. The connectivity of the world is such that we don't have to be in that part of the world where the action is happening to get the consequence of its results. But not only is the world connected in ways where you should understand it even if you don't appreciate the connectivity in real terms, the world also exists in a certain characterization called a global order. For the last 80 years, there have been varying shifts in that global order. The end of World War II led to a certain order, bipolarity, the Cold War. Here is a flag to the bottom, the left of the screen that you often don't see these days. But 20, 30 years ago, that flag there was a prominent representation of what the order was. There were two great giants controlling things across the global order, the USSR and the United States. It was called the Cold War. The Caribbean was caught up in that Cold War. And then 1989 saw the fall of the Berlin Wall that led to a cascade of events ending in the dissolution of the USSR. When the USSR was dissolved formally in 1991, there remained one global power. So between 1991 and 2016, 2017, 2018, there was one pole of power, the United States of America. But didn't stay that way all the time. In the USSR, there was a guy called Vladimir Putin. When he became president in the year 2000, he said, things have got to change. And Mr. Putin began to make the moves to re-strengthen the USSR, now Russia. And then you may not have heard what was happening over in China, but in 1978, rose to power a diminutive gentleman called Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping said China has to change who it is and what it becomes. And so from the mid-2000s, you began to see a realignment of Russia, a realignment of China, flexing their economic, political, and military muscles to the point where it was no longer a unipolar world led by the United States. We have now been part of a multipolar world. But hear this. The multipolar dimensions are economic and military and political. And you don't have to be an expert in these matters to understand how the world has changed if you just took the 30 years between 1993 and 2023. The EU and the US were number 1 and 2 in global economic output in 1993. China and India were down 5 and 6. But look at 2023. China has eclipsed the United States. The United States has eclipsed India, but India has moved up. The point I'm making is that the order has shifted. It is no longer a unipolar order. There are other nations flexing their muscles, and some of those flexing of muscles are affecting us, whether we know it or not. We are part of the greater game. You don't have to know it, but we are being affected by it. We cannot end the conversation with multipolarity without referring to a central personality in the global order. A gentleman called the Secretary of State of the United States, Mr. Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is a distinguished, articulate practitioner for his nation. And he has the dubious distinction of being only the second person in United States history to have a combination of roles that suggests that it is not an ordinary personality with whom you're dealing. Marco Rubio is only the second person in US history to have the combined role of Secretary of State and National Security Advisor at the same time. The other person was Henry Kissinger. So what Marco Rubio says matters, not only for the United States, it matters for the global community, because the United States is still an important pole of power. Marco Rubio was confirmed unanimously by the Senate. And 10 days after his confirmation, he gave a very thoughtful, wide-ranging interview to one of the media personalities, Megyn Kelly. And I wanted to share a couple of sentences from that interview where he talked about the multipolarity. We don't have to know that multipolarity exists, but we are affected by it. He said it's not normal for the world to simply have one unipolar power. He said that was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multi-great powers in different parts of the planet. We face that now, says Mr. Rubio, with China and to some extent Russia, and then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea. Marco Rubio's candor, his articulate representation of how the United States sees the world, is something that I recommend. If you're interested in matters of state, you read that interview. Thoughtful, multifaceted interview. But hear this. While Russia and China were also gaining strength economically, not only were they interested in being individual poles of power, they thought it might be useful to combine with other countries to create a different kind of pole power. And so you had in 2009 a number of countries, Brazil, Russia, China, and India, they said, why don't we form a little pole by ourselves? That pole was called what? BRIC. And then the year after, who joined BRIC? We said it's a conversation, not just a speech. Who joined BRIC? South Africa. So we have what? BRICS. Individual countries that are gaining in strength, challenging that established power, say, let's get together. And it seems as though they got plenty BRICS. Because look in our own regional hemispheric neighborhood. Cuba is a probation member of BRIC. Bolivia is in BRIC. Multipolarity, whether we know it or not, the global geopolitical arrangements are affecting us. One of the countries that was put on hold, tried to get into BRIC, is Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro went himself to Kazan, Russia, for the conversation. And BRIC operates on the basis of unanimity. All the members have to agree with who would join. And I give you $100 of the president's money. He doesn't spend any money, is there? Guess who held up Venezuela's candidacy to become a part? Brazil. Brazil said, not so fast. Remember that election you had in July of last year? Are we not sure that you were the official winner? Let's see the receipts. Momentico, senor. No, we want to see the receipts. Brazil's discomfort with the outcome of the elections led Brazil to say, not so fast. Venezuela has not been admitted to BRICS. So I use this to say to you that we may not understand the global dynamics affecting us, but those dynamics affect us. And to understand the radar requests, you've got to step out of Grenada. You've got to step into the global commons. You've got to step into the geopolitical world to see things that are happening that you may not know about in your daily lives that affect the outcomes and the disposition affecting you. So I think it's important to, in the context of the global context, understand what unipolarity, multipolarity, and the rise of BRICS. And we'll come back to see how BRICS is affecting us in a minute. But let's end with the region. The book that I wrote last year, coming out of that Eric Williams Memorial Lecture, I propose that we recognize in the region that we exist in a condition I call challenged sovereignty. I think they mopped this thing, right? So I can put this last. And here is what I define challenged sovereignty to be. It's a condition where a state's vulnerability is exacerbated by internal or external developments that compromise the ability of the supreme authority of the state to promulgate and execute, etc., etc. For me, you have to appreciate the challenged sovereignty nature of the region when you come to consider that request. If the request were made to Antigua and Barbuda, you would have had to consider that challenged sovereignty in the decision. Irrespective of which Caribbean country that request was made to, you have to appreciate the challenged sovereignty nature of our region. And I lay out in that book the three critical conditions of challenged sovereignty. I'm not going to go through them all. I'll just read number 1 and 3. The authorized officials of a state can no longer effectively protect the territorial integrity of their state from intruders. Some of these intruders are just non-state actors. Some of them don't want to stay permanently in your state, they just want to pass through. If your sovereignty is challenged to the point where you can't control who goes through or who comes in, you have a problem. But look at condition 3. The authorized officials of a state lack the requisite capabilities to exercise effective internal public order and external sovereign control, which necessitates reliance on external capabilities. When I came in March of this year, I gave a lecture to the police high command. And I shared with them an experience of another Caribbean state. It's about a decade old. And I used that experience to dramatize the third condition. I'm friends of lots of police and security officials across the region. And one police chief was commiserating with me about an experience his force had just had. This is what that experience was. They were chasing a go-fast boat. They suspect it was drugs. The Coast Guard vessel of this Caribbean country ran out of fuel. The Coast Guard could not catch the go-fast. They had to be rescued by another Caribbean jurisdiction. So I asked my friend, I said, let's say his name is Jack. I said, Jack, how could this be? Jack began to explain a reality of condition number 3. Like many Caribbean jurisdictions, this Coast Guard in question, all the vessels were gifts. But with the gift did not come maintenance. They did not even know the fuel gauge was not working. It's funny, but the limitations of their resources were such, they can't afford to buy it. They got a gift. People who give it say, look, you got to find the money to fix it up. The money was not there. So there was no maintenance. They did not even know the fuel gauge. And so they would put fuel. The thing run out, they didn't know. The double embarrassment of the bad guys getting away, but then another jurisdiction. And I tell you what, this jurisdiction was an extra Caribbean jurisdiction in the Caribbean. You know, in the Caribbean, we have British extraterritorial, we have French, we have Dutch. It was an embarrassment, but it highlighted this challenge sovereignty that you can't afford to maintain your own. You have to rely upon others. If you have that condition, which all Caribbean countries have to one degree or another, your sovereignty is challenged. I once told, didn't make me popular, I gave a keynote of a military commanders conference, and I said, you know, if the average Caribbean citizen knows who pays the bills for most of our police forces and defense, they'll be mad at the politicians. We have to rely upon the Americans, the British, the Dutch, the French. Challenge sovereignty. So when we talk about the radar, my recommendation is that we keep in mind those global and those local conditions. They influence what decisions can be, not only in regard to this radar matter, they influence what decisions have been for a number of years in regard to a number of different things. But let's move on. I've already spoken for like 5 minutes. Decimal, like five Guyanese minutes. So here's the second question. What are some contemporary geopolitical realities that dramatize Grenada's vulnerability? Before we get to the crux of the matter, I want to leave some words of wisdom that are relevant by 2 gentlemen, one of whom is not from this region, one of whom is from this region. President Nelson Mandela was appearing at a forum at City College in New York in 1990. It was moderated by a distinguished journalist called Ted Koppel. You can Google and sometimes find that clip. He was asked by a member of the audience, how can you do and say all these nice things about Cuba and Libya, given all that? His first response to that question was this: one of the mistakes that some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. Nelson Mandela. But listen to what former Prime Minister Errol Barrow said. He was at the time delivering his first speech as Prime Minister of the then newly independent Barbados. Barbados was admitted to the General Assembly in December 1966. And I want to leave you the few sentences to ruminate on. They have to do with the conditions the region is experiencing now. We have no quarrels to pursue, and we particularly insist that we do not regard any member state as our natural opponent. We shall not involve ourselves in sterile ideological wranglings because we are exponents not of the diplomacy of power, but of the diplomacy of peace and prosperity. He didn't stop there. He said, we will not regard any great power as necessarily right in a given dispute unless we are convinced of this. Yet at the same time, we will not view the great powers with perennial suspicion merely on account of their size, their wealth, or their nuclear potential. And this is a sentence that he ended that paragraph with, a sentence that has been used by Prime Minister Mia Mottley and others in recent times. We will be friends of all and satellites of none. I recommend that you keep those words in mind because those words help to give you a flavor of the conditionalities that leaders in the region now have to keep in mind, conscious of the challenge sovereignty, conscious that we're not an island or to ourselves, conscious that we are part of a geopolitical game that we sometimes don't have any control over. Every Grenadian held his breath once the word was out that a request was made. The request was made in August, but it was not until October that the government came out. Somebody kind of spilled the beans and they said, well, we got to talk about it. No, we can't keep this thing a secret too long. It wasn't you, Peter, that he invoked Shaggy, it wasn't me. The government had to come out and acknowledge, we have a request, we have a request, we have a request. And then it took a while before the Prime Minister said something about it. Went to Parliament. He didn't go to the upper chamber. He went in the popular elected chamber, and he explained some context and background. Francis and I did a radio interview yesterday, and I shared with the radio audience. I said, tomorrow when I give this lecture, I'm going to share a cartoon. The cartoon is capturing some of the intricacies of decision-making versus non-decision-making. You may not be able to read the fine print, so I'll read it for you. I'd rather hold off on making a decision until we have a better excuse to not make any decision at all. It leads you to wonder which of these 11 ways of saying no without saying no is Grenada using or has used. Because unless somebody knows a secret that I don't know, the Prime Minister still hasn't said yes or no. Let me repeat that fine print in the cartoon. I'd rather hold off on making a decision until we have a better excuse to not make any decision at all. But the Prime Minister also explained when he went to the Parliament that the United States had given a certain deadline for response. And so, in a way, the non-response is also a response. And given the exigencies of the United States military operation, they said, we've got to have a plan B. My wife and I were in Trinidad last week for another set of events. Trinidadians are still ruminating, people in Tobago in particular. Many of them are upset because it was not even a conversation with some of their chief secretary and other officials. The United States has acted in the absence of a decision, which is a non-decision decision. They have gone ahead and done what they consider necessary. I want to share with you another philosopher of mine, something that he said that is relevant to this conversation. The gentleman is called Jorge Agustin Nicolás Ruiz de Santillana y Borràs. He's popularly known as George Santayana. Santayana is probably more popularly known because of his proposition, those who fail to recognize history may be condemned to repeat it. But I want to leave with you another proposition by Santayana that is, I think, relevant to this saga. He said, skepticism is the chastity of the intellect. Why do I put Santayana in the conversation? I put Santayana because there's a lot of skepticism about why the United States won this radar. A lot of skepticism about what the ultimate or actual mission is. Is it really about drugs? If it's really about drugs, why this massive force deployment? Skepticism is the chastity of the intellect. But there are other bases for the skepticism. One of the bases for the skepticism has to do with the question, where do most of the drugs going to the United States from South America go through? Read for yourself. Most of the drugs do not go to the Caribbean. Most of the cocaine does not go to the Caribbean. Most of the cocaine going to the United States goes through the Pacific into the west coast of the United States or directly to the United States. Some goes to the Caribbean. And much of it does not have to do with Venezuela. Skepticism is the chastity of the... And there is even greater skepticism when you consider what happened just last week. A guy who was actually convicted and imprisoned for trafficking drugs was released. Is this radar really for about drugs? Skepticism is the chastity of the intellect. But I think there is an October connection to what I call memory and moment that is caught up in this saga. As I said earlier, and as we all know, the request was made in August. It took almost 2 months before the government can say something about it. And it happens to be that in a month that evokes strong, sometimes negative memories for Grenada. The month of Grenada represents implosion of the revolution. The month of Grenada evokes memories of the intervention of the United States and other countries. Well, I say intervention. I'll tell you why in a minute. You know, there is an old saying called Miles' Law. Where you stand depends on where you sit. I'll tell you in a minute why I prefer to use the term intervention, not U.S. invasion. We'll come to that in a minute. So whether you are pro or opposed to a certain counter-narcotics practice. Coming in on October raised a whole lot of issues. It evoked some memories. It came at a moment that was not a salutary moment on the part of Grenadians at home and Grenadians in the diaspora. And I think part of the saga's ups and downs had to do with that October month, bringing so many memories back. But here is what, for me, represents the crux of the geopolitical, the sovereignty nexus, the vulnerability, what I call the vulnerability matrix. Especially if you're a small state, but even if you're a middle-sized power, leaders of small countries cannot operate in the principle alone. You've got to be pragmatic and principled. And sometimes the scales of balance go in the side of pragmatism, not on the part of principle. It is for Grenadians to decide how to balance that scale. But I recommend that in the context of balancing that principles and pragmatism scale, risk tolerance has got to be part of the conversation. What is Grenada willing to risk if it does A as opposed to B? It's always, I think, useful to also ask, in the context of that balancing principle and pragmatism, are there things that we can get out of this deal? What might be in it for us if we were to say, yeah? You don't have to be in the government to understand that reality, but I recommend, as a person looking from the outside, having a sense of what the dynamics of the region and other countries are all about. It makes no sense to have a conversation where you don't put something for you on a request coming to you. And part of that conversation Grenada has to have among its leadership in regard to what are the vulnerability areas. I recommend that there are 6 possible vulnerability areas, whether you know it or not, that will be part of any conversation and a part of Grenada's political elites. Some of them are direct, some of them are indirect vulnerabilities. Tourism has got to be part of the vulnerability calculation. How might we be affected if we decide A or B? It may not be a perfect decision. There's no such thing as a perfect decision sometimes, but I would hazard a conjecture that it would be imprudent for any decision maker in Grenada or any other country in the Caribbean considering a request like this not to think of its economic fulcrum. And Grenada's economic fulcrum has that T word in it, significant. Connected to that economic fulcrum is the St. George's University. And I'll come back to St. George's University as a variable matrix element. People take their visas to the United States seriously. United States has been using that visa as a weapon, as a threat. I may not give you, or I might take back what I give you, and they have the right to do it. Grenadian decision makers have got to consider the visa revocation or the visa denial element as a vulnerability matrix element. Grenada also has to consider, might the citizenship by investment program be a vulnerability point? I'll bet you $100 of Ezra's money. It is. You may or may not know of the oil exploration work happening on behalf of Grenada now. I recommend that that is a vulnerability point for Grenada. What about its RSS? Grenada's law enforcement is dependent on the regional security system, a significant proportion of funding for which comes from where? The United States. My recommendation then, colleagues, is that as you think of principle versus pragmatism, you've got to think of what may be the weak spots, what would be the vulnerability areas, what are the things that might affect us. And I thought I'd remind us with some of the stats for tourism 2024 compared to 2025, July. Grenada has already begun to experience a decline in arrivals, 10% from the United States, 10.6%, 8.6% from the United Kingdom. So it is already a weak spot. It would be imprudent of any decision-making Grenada not to consider that as a vulnerability weak spot. SGU is a major contributor to Grenada's economy by injecting over 100 million annually into the local economy, et cetera, et cetera. Vulnerability matrix. Grenada would have to consider this is a weak spot. It can affect the society. And I took the opportunity of reading that International Monetary Fund report for Grenada of last month. If you haven't read it, you need to read it. What the IMF is suggesting, the conditions of Grenada have some elements of weakness in regards to tourism, in regards to climate, in regards to, you read. My bottom line is, before we get to question 3, asking about the vulnerability issue connected to the radar requires us to go beyond looking at the request itself, to look at things that may be part of the matrix of decision making that have to do with principle versus pragmatism. But let's get to the final question. People are anxious for me to stop talking, right? So he said I should talk more, should I? You say yes. For another hour? No, half hour. What are some of the region-wide implications? I want to recommend to you that this question itself has an implicit proposition. The proposition is that asking about regional implications suggests that there are regional implications beyond Grenada. I want to leave with you 2 implications and what I call 2 ironies. Can you lend me some of that? First implication, and here is where I come to that word intervention. As happened in 1983, with my word intervention, the saga that we're experiencing currently is fracturing CARICOM. And I wanted to put up that map to the right to remind us that, and for me, it was not just an United States invasion, it was an invasion from the United States with an intervention by other Caribbean countries. Sometimes these inconvenient truths are hard to swallow. But it was not only the United States that decided to come in and do something. Barbados, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Dominica, not St. Lucian, Antigua. There were a number of other small, tiny, minuscule, symbolic but they all contributed to the fracturing. The fracturing of CARICOM was not only a function of United States intervention. It was a function of other Caribbean countries that were on one side of the fence and others were on the other side of the fence. For me, you've got to remember both elements of the 1983 October episode. The United States was part of it, but other Caribbean countries were part of it. And that led for more than 2 or 3 years fracturing within CARICOM. We're beginning to see evidence of a fracturing in relation to this. And let me suggest to you that part of that fracturing is a result of a conundrum that exists within CARICOM. CARICOM is not a unitary body. It's a collection of sovereign states. And when they joined together, they didn't give up their individual sovereign rights. They make some collective decisions, but they retain their sovereign right to do differently or say differently or act differently in relation to somebody in or out of CARICOM. And so Trinidad is exercising that sovereign right to say, yeah, my CARICOM brothers and sisters, going too far. Yes, my CARICOM brothers and sisters, I take a different view in regard to the United States engagement. That is one implication of the saga. You're seeing a fracturing of CARICOM. I'm hopeful that the fracturing would not be long-lasting, that folks will make up and kiss up, get a nice roti down in Tunapuna, get some nice bus-up shop down in Bebe, get a nice, make sure you get El Dorado rum from Ghana to bring them together. And get some oil down. I'm talking about oil down just now. But that for me is one implication. But there's a second implication. This saga reflects broader multipolar geopolitical dynamics with relevant major powers centers being the United States, China, Russia, etc. And those countries that I have in white are part of what? Those countries that are in white are part of what? BRICS. So, America is saying, you have these Cuba people here in BRICS, you have this Brazil guy in BRICS, you have Iran cozying up to Venezuela. I got to do something about this thing. There are broader geopolitical dynamics. And some of those dynamics have to do with Grenada in the broader geopolitical space. Grenada and Venezuela, strong partnership. For reasons that Grenada decides are in its interests. Grenada and China. There are not too many small states like Grenada that will have an opportunity to go to China and meet the president of a nation, 1.3 billion people, who will take out 30 minutes of his time to greet you, and even if only for a moment. That picture is a symbolic, powerful symbolic message. To whom? To the United States. That I can play in your area. I can bring your people. When Francine and I came here in October, there was no jet bridge. When we came back Sunday, guess what? Jet bridge. And who built the jet bridge? I can't hear you. Who built the jet bridge? This guy don't want to call that word. Who built the jet bridge? China, I gotta force him out of him. China built that jet bridge. Broader multipolar geopolitical dynamics, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not. Grenada National Resort. Maybe when I come back 2 years from now, I'll stay there rather than Sandals. Who is developing that national tourism masterpiece? Let me go to this side. Who's building that thing?
China.
Say it again.
China.
The boy at the back didn't hear you.
China.
China. But others in the neighborhood have those geopolitical dynamics that are understandably worrying the United States. Russia has been strengthening its relationship with Venezuela in the energy sector, in the military sector, in their economy. China also has been strengthening its economic relationship with Venezuela. A couple of months ago, a massive oil platform flowed into Lake Maracaibo, part of Venezuela's positioning itself to reestablish a point of pride, a place of pride. And so, if you're Secretary of State with the view of the multipolarity of the world, and you identify China and Russia as key parts of your areas of concern, you're going to be worried about what's happening between China and Venezuela. And as collateral damage, Spice Isle get affected, Antigua Barbuda get affected, Trinidad and Tobago get affected. You don't have to know the dynamics, but the dynamics are there. You remember in that map of the BRICS, we had that other country that begins with C? Cuba? Mr. Rubio has made it patent. Cuba is in the crosshairs because the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela has been a significant one, enabling the Cubans to be strengthening their capacity to resist, to maintain the kind of political arrangements they have, the human rights profile that they have. So it is public knowledge that not only are they unhappy with Cuba, they see a nexus between Venezuela and Cuba that helping to weaken Venezuela will also serve to weaken Cuba. You may not know of the dynamics, but they exist. But I want to recommend that there are not only implications, I see certain ironies in this saga. I'll mention two. The zone of peace recommendation came out of a certain country back in the 70s. What's that country? What's that country? Trinidad and Tobago. In Chaguaramas, Prime Minister Eric Williams is the first person to say, this region needs to be a zone of peace. So is it not ironic that the leader of the very country that advocated first this zone of peace, that leader should be saying, this zone of peace doesn't make no sense. This zone of peace doesn't exist. The notion that the Caribbean is a zone of peace has become a false ideal. So says the Prime Minister of the same country that proposed it in 1972. That, for me, is one of the ironies of this saga. But there's a second irony, as if we were not unhappy enough with the first. When the CARICOM leaders met virtually on October 18, they had a certain position. The only person that said, I ain't in this, is who? Prime Minister of Trinidad said, no, y'all can do your thing, I am doing something else. I'm going with the United States. But the irony is not only in the fact, the irony is not simply in the fact of what position Trinidad took. The irony to me inheres in the fact that Trinidad is a country with lead responsibility in the CARICOM quasi-cabinet for what? For security. So you in charge of regional security, and you were saying, man, forget that regional security thing. I gang with America. Uncle Sam is a good friend of mine. I can hang with him. I think whether you're supporting Trinidad's position or not, there's an irony in that. But let me say this, and I'm going to develop this point in the book as when I write the book. Without explicitly saying it, what the Prime Minister of Trinidad is doing is accessing and implementing its sovereign right to go against what the CARICOM group says. Because the CARICOM group does not bind any individual country to act as the group decides. You saw it in 1983. Jamaica, Guyana, and others say, no, we're not intervening in Grenada. Jamaica was there. My apologies, Jamaica was there. Guyana held out. Trinidad held out. The Trinis held out, right? Similarly, the sovereign right of Trinidad is there to say, I am not in this one. But here's another element of the dynamics of Zone of Peace. Although she did not explicitly say it, what the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister was saying is that we need a different conception of what is a zone of peace. She's saying we can't afford to have all this crime in some of our countries and then talking about a zone of peace. When we have war in our countries, you've got to acknowledge that's a point. 624 murders in Trinidad and Tobago last year. Thankfully, Barbados' murder rate is coming down. But look at the Barbados. Look at the Eastern Caribbean countries except Grenada. Homicides are on the uptick. What the Prime Minister was saying, we are living a false moment in calling for a zone of peace when we don't have peace in our own homes. She is redefining what a zone of peace is. And she has the right to do it because she has a sovereign responsibility, even though she's part of a CARICOM. It's an irony, but it is also a reality. She defines it to be the way she sees it. I want to end by leaving with us some words of wisdom from voices of people who've moved on. I'm going to take the trouble of reading the full quotation I have there for both April 1979 and October 1979. Maurice Bishop. Grenada is a sovereign and independent country. Although a tiny speck on the world map, when we expect all countries to strictly respect our independence, just as we respect theirs. No country has the right to tell us what to do or how to run our country or who to be friendly with, said Mr. Bishop. We certainly would not attempt to tell any other country what to do. We are not in anybody's backyard, and we are definitely not for sale. I think the October memory and moment meeting would evoke memories of that assertion by Mr. Bishop. And I would bet you, means we're going to move money I can give away this time. Where's the Secretary of the GBA? The Secretary of the GBA has money to give away. I'll bet you $100 of the Secretary's money. The people who are thinking about the radar requests would be mindful of what Maurice Bishop said in 1979. They may not tell you this, But they also would be mindful of what he said when he spoke to the General Assembly. We desire normal, friendly relations with the United States of America. Many of our citizens reside and work in this country, and many citizens are frequent visitors to our country. Tourism, SGU. But it must be manifestly clear that our relations must be based on the fundamental principles of mutual respect for sovereignty, equality, and the non-interference in each other's internal affairs, a position which in fact applies to all states. You have to be thinking, Maurice Bishop, as you think about the radar requests, as you think of the geopolitical games, as you think of principle versus pragmatism. But I think this is a gentleman who also was one of the speakers over the years. Anybody recognize that gentleman? Just read that Ramful. He gave the opening remarks at a conference in 1985, a conference on small state dilemmas in the Commonwealth. And he said something which I've used over the years because I think it captures a certain conundrum for Caribbean and other small states. Sometimes it seems as if your small states were like small boats pushed out into a turbulent sea, free in one sense to traverse it, but without oars or provisions, without compass or sail, free also to perish. Or perhaps to be rescued and taken aboard a larger vessel. The question often becomes, what might be that larger vessel? I argue that CARICOM is that larger vessel. But there are many countries that would jump the CARICOM ship to go into another larger vessel. That, I think, is part of the conundrum. So I want to leave you with the words of Sir Sridhar Ramphul, which I think represents an important conundrum. Thank you.
Thank you again to Professor Griffith for his insightful contribution. Another round of applause, please. Thank you. So conversations surrounding tonight's topics definitely raise serious, complex concerns. So I would say that Professor definitely did an excellent job in presenting tonight's presentation in a comprehensive and digestible format. Caribbean states must think boldly, collaborate wisely, and adapt quickly. Dialogue is critical, and again, we thank Professor Griffith for his contribution. There was a point in the lecture that I would say stood out to me in terms of geopolitical contributions, and I would like to commend Grenada, because I think Grenada is showing a lot of foresight in terms of strengthening its relationships with other states. In particular, in July, we hosted the Afro-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum at Radisson, and it was definitely a success. Right, so just a reminder to our audience and our online viewers, we actually have a bit over 200 persons online, so we thank you for participating. Remember that Professor has these 2 books on sale. Great. And I am definitely interested in purchasing, so if anyone is interested in gifting, I think we would have a very great mutual relationship, okay? So at this time, we move into our interactive question and answer segment. So this is where you get to direct your difficult questions to Professor, and he definitely will answer them. So persons online, we invite you to send in your questions, and we will try to facilitate you as best as possible. So everyone, please, these are the 2 mics that you can use, and we do ask that you keep the questions brief so that we can answer you and allow everyone an opportunity to contribute.
I will be brief. Professor, seeing that the radar system is now being installed in Tobago, I want to ask your personal opinion. Do you think automatically the request for installing said radar system in Grenada is no longer necessary?
There's a now dead gentleman who had the distinction of being, on 2 different occasions, Secretary of Defense of the United States. His name is Donald Rumsfeld. And Donald Rumsfeld introduced a proposition during the Iraq War when he was responding to a question from a journalist. I think of Donald Rumsfeld's proposition in responding to that question in relation to your question. This is what Donald Rumsfeld said back then. He said, sometimes we have known knowns, but we also have known unknowns. But sometimes we even have unknown unknowns. Your question falls into that category. It's a known unknown. And I say it's a known unknown because the installation of a radar request of the installation of the radar equipment in Tobago does not mean that there may not be other requests along a military or a counter-narcotics trajectory that may be put to Grenada or another nation. So, known unknown. I think they want you to use the mic because the people in the virtual space would need to hear the question. You have a portable mic? Peter has some known unknowns coming, so.
Brief question. I have other questions, but just in connection with what you said. There's a view by some people that the U.S. didn't really need the radar system in Grenada, but there was an attempt to test where Grenada fell in relation to all of the other things happening around the region. What's your view of that? Is that a possible?
That's a plausible possibility.
Professor Griffith, I want to thank you for a comprehensive presentation. I want to better understand 2 concepts you dealt with, the question of what constitutes an invasion. It seems to me that my understanding of this concept is an unwanted incursion into another country's sovereign space or territory. I think that's what happened in 1983. I think it's a bit of a euphemism and an inaccurate description of what actually transpired, if you characterize it as an intervention. In Grenada, I think some of us, we tend to have a difficulty in being brutally frank in calling a spade a spade. So maybe you can help me to better understand why you should characterize it as an intervention. The second point I want to make has to do with the issue of a zone of peace. My understanding is that when the concept was proffered, it had to do with a geopolitical situation, a state of relationships between states, dealing with the issue of war, or state of war or hostility between states, sovereign states. Not so much a description of the social and domestic conditions within a country, whether there's crime or civil unrest and so on. So again, I have some difficulty, in seeing anything else than what it was intended to mean, right, as a zone of peace. These are the 2 things I just want you to respond to these things.
Thank you. Let me deal with the second one first. The zone of peace concept is always a tenuous balance between two B words. Balance between being at peace and becoming at peace. You're quite correct that zone of peace concept, which is not unique to the Caribbean, is a concept having to do with interstate dynamics. How might we stay without war among states in an area? And how might we create conditions to become continuously at peace? There's an element of now and there's an element of ideal. That's the conventional approach to zones of peace. But my view is that the Trinidad and Tobago leadership were reinterpreting zone of peace given their own domestic realities. And you can understand the Prime Minister's concern. I don't think she is unaware of what was proposed in Chaguaramas in 1972. But she's facing a real-life circumstance where there is war within her country. So she's saying, out with this nonsense of looking at international. We've got to look at the war within. So for me, I see her approach as redefining what zone of peace is. The conventional approach is interstate, between. Let's keep this place peaceful so that we can become more at peace, less at war. Prime Minister Trinidad is saying, all these murders, all these gangs, and I saw an interesting statistic last year out of the conference where we launched this book on violence and arms trafficking. An increase in the number of gangs led by women in Trinidad. So if you're the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, you can say, all this stuff happening in my country, how can I be talking about a zone of peace? So she is redefining the traditional definition, given the reality that she is facing. The book that I know that you'll buy a copy of, President of the Senate will buy 2 copies, her staff and herself. I spent a chapter looking at the circumstance of Trinidad in 2011, the state of emergency that was declared. The chapter also looked at the states of emergency in Jamaica coming out of the Christopher Dudos Coke saga. What Jamaica was experiencing was internal war. What Trinidad was experiencing in 2011 was internal war. They had to declare a state of emergency last year again. It ended just before elections, but people were so fed up with the crime, what did they do? They voted the government out. So the practical reality the Trinidad leadership is facing is that we would love to have this becoming peaceful, but we are facing the circumstance of the actuality of internal war. Let me come to the first issue you raised. The 2 I words, invasion versus intervention. Both, for me, have elements of intrusion in another jurisdiction by another force, but for me, it is not simply an intrusion from the United States that we've got to consider in looking at who the practitioners. You've got to consider the pursuit of a certain geopolitical, ideological motive by one practitioner. But there were other motives, and even though there were small, minuscule forces, you had people from the military sector also in there. So for me, the inclusion of the Caribbean forces devalues the strengths of saying it was an invasion. You probably can make your own rebuttal and say it was an invasion by everybody. But for me, it was an intervention that had elements of an invasion and elements of a different kind of intent on the part of the CARICOM countries. But one of the good things about the Academy is that you can write a whole article or a book. the difference between invasion and intervention. But I hold on the intervention because it was a multiplicity of forces with different reasonings for wanting to go there.
Two short questions, please, Professor.
Surely.
One is, what would you say are some of the things that Caribbean countries should be doing at this time to protect their sovereignty and to reduce their vulnerability? In other words, there must be some prescriptions that you've thought about in the present geopolitical dynamic. We would love to hear from you on that point. Secondly, what do you see as the emerging role of the United Nations, International Criminal Court, and some of the other multilateral and international institutions in the present multipolar dynamic that is unfolding? Yeah.
Good. That book that you're going to buy, Challenge Sovereignty. One of the questions I asked in the final chapter, having looked at the saga for the region, look at the crime, the drugs, the terrorism, the cybercrime, I asked the question, how secure is the Caribbean? My answer was not very. I asked the question, how sovereign is sovereignty in the Caribbean? My answer is not very sovereign. That condition exists. And the absence of that strong sovereignty has to do with the capability limitations. How might the sovereignty and security be strengthened? There were some wise men who met in the early 70s and had a vision that we have not embraced fully. This CARICOM could have been a strong state were it a unified, unitary state. We allow some fractures within our own family. Everybody got independence in the 60s and the 78 and 79, and they want to maintain this independence. You strengthen the capacity by being more unified. And you look at those institutions that were created where the fractures nature is evident. I talk in the book about an institution, the former chief of which was one of your speakers, a friend of mine, Adrian Saunders, formed by CARICOM countries. The country that is hosting it said what? I ain't joining it. Jamaica said, I prefer to have my own Supreme Court. I ain't joining anything. How do you expect people to take you seriously if you can't even get your collective act together as a region? Now, there's an argument some people make, well, we've got to vote in the UN. We've got to vote in the OAS. But how real is that vote when your economic ability to service that vote is weakened? Summit of the Americas was canceled from December. Hopefully it will be held in 2026. I want you to pay attention to who would be going to that summit and how they will get there. Who will pay the bills for the delegations going to those summits? So much of what we do is a sovereignty in name and a pretense in reality. So the accretions of securing that sovereignty, for me, require that we have to collectively embrace the institutions that already exist. Join the CCJ. And the irony is that Trinidad not only had the headquarters agreement and is investing so much money, but is making contribution. You know what Kwame Nkrumah said back in the 1950s? The greatest challenge of decolonization is decolonization of the mind. We are still caught up in many parts of the region, including in Grenada, with the notions of the monarchy better. So we want to go to the Privy Council. The Privy Council said, you guys got a fabulous court of your own. But let me come to the other issue. The capacity to exercise sovereignty at that international level. The harsh reality, and we're seeing it now in the last 2-3 years, there's a diminution of respect and an undermining of some of those international United Nations institutions in the context of the polarity of the world. And in the context of that polarity, I don't anticipate Caribbean countries would have, unless they were unified, any margins of success greater than the margins of success we already have. So I think it is a good thing to have the independence. It's a good thing to want to liberate your individual sovereignty by not getting together collectively. But it undermines and it creates a condition where you're going to be in perpetual challenge sovereignty. Get your act together. You know, one of the valuable things that the OECS has done, which is a model for the entire region, you buy all your pharmaceuticals. You have one currency, a currency that's been stable for decades. Think of if there was one CARICOM dollar. Difficult to happen, but not beyond the realm of the possibility. If there could be a euro, why can there not be a CARICOM dollar? Hard to get there, but it would enable the fractiousness to be exploited by people who've got a vested interest in not being together. So when you look, for me, when you look at the global landscape, it's a pretty grim picture. I'm not fatalistic, but it's a pretty grim picture.
Thanks, Professor.
Sure.
It's very comprehensive lecture and public engagement. And I really thank you because for years I've read your books, and as a student of international relations, I really appreciated this. I want to go back to the panel discussion we had last night, and if you would permit me to make 2 points
Sure.
that I made last night to answer, well, to give my own views on sovereignty and zone of peace. I accept that sovereignty is challenged, and you're very right on that. But last night when you were moderating and I was presenting on the paradoxes of sovereignty, you may recall that I said one of the paradoxes is this: because sovereignty is challenged, and the more it is challenged, the more it must be defended as a symbolic asset. Because it is challenged, it must be defended. And that goes back to your point about principle and pragmatism. So the pragmatism is real, but part of the principle must be you have to defend the sovereignty because it is challenged. And you can only do that effectively, collectively. So I'm agreeing with you that that larger vessel must be a regional security regionalism that would help us. I want to make a point about the zone of peace. And it's very nuanced. We accept the traditional notion of what the zone of peace is, interstate relations. But you may recall last night I was reaching for Ken Booth, that critical security scholar, who argued that you have to simultaneously protect the shelter, which is the house, the national security, and the sheltered, those within it. That coming together of national security and human security. So what we are facing now as the Prime Minister of Trinidad is trying to reconceptualize the zone of peace. I think we have to accept the interstate relations and the complexity of security. So the zone of peace, in my mind, has to address the interstate. But given the war within communities, we can't deny the shelter and the sheltered. So it's the intersection of the the House and those within it in terms of understanding the zones of peace between states and within states. Thank you very much again.
Let the church say amen. I agree with you entirely. I agree with you, Wendy.
Sorry, Professor, again. I just wanted to deal with the issue of Trinidad and Tobago. I think we're being extremely charitable to the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago because the issue, zone of peace, we can have an argument about how we perceive zone of peace. But I don't think there's anybody in the world who believes that the U.S. build-up in a region has anything to do with drugs. I mean, in your own chart a while ago, you saw that fentanyl goes along the Pacific coast. So to suggest that the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is saying, I am joining this crusade against drugs in Venezuela, is to suggest that it's really a crusade against drugs. It's actually an attempt to topple the Venezuelan government. I think the U.S., over the last couple of days, if you listen to all of the persons, State Department, CIA, they're saying that. So I think essentially it is on her part, joining of that crusade to topple the U.S., the Venezuelan government is what the U.S. is about, but her suggesting that it's going to assist Trinidad and Tobago in terms of the drug trade, I believe is just an excuse to be participant in what I believe is an attempt on invasion of Venezuela. So I think it's a little too charitable to see it as some kind of redefining of zone of peace. I think it's just an opportunistic attempt to join the invading forces in Venezuela.
Thank you, Paul. I want to make two comments on that. One of which is to repeat something I said when Mr. Paul and I were on radio yesterday. I said, you know, in agricultural societies like the one that I'm from, Guyana, and I'm sure it exists in Grenada, there is sometimes a saying, there is more in the mortar than the pestle. I think that saying applies to the saga. There's more in the mortar than the pestle. Here's my second comment. One of the reasons I was in Trinidad last week was for the launch of a just-released study on global cocaine operations. There's a chapter in Colombia. There's a chapter in the United States. There's a chapter in Ecuador. There's a chapter in Brazil. There's a chapter in Africa, on Asia and Oceania. Guess what country there is not a chapter on? There is not a chapter on Venezuela. There is more in the mortar than the drug pestle. Anything else?
As Pedro was talking there, well, we call him Pedro.
So you're accentuating his Venezuelan side? Is that what you're saying?
He's Spanish. Yeah, one of the thoughts that crossed my mind as I was listening to him, and to you as well, is that, you know, underlying this entire situation appears to be a problem of scarcity, resources. You know, whether we're talking vulnerability or we're talking sovereignty, what appear to constrain these countries is the fact that they just don't have the means, yeah? And I would love to hear you say a little bit more about resource limitations and how that is impacting what is happening in the region and in the world, really, because it seems to me that this is the heart of the problem.
Well, I would argue you're correct that is part of the problem. Resources, what I call the capabilities gap. But while capabilities are necessary, capabilities by themselves are not sufficient. You've got to have wise management of the capabilities. You've got to have resource utilization of the resources you have to maximize the profit, the returns, and the investment in those resources. You know better than I that this is a budget time in Grenada. And that is a practical consideration which has got to be in the fore of the mind of every Grenadian. But I want to suggest that it is not only how the money is allocated, it's how the money is managed. So the capabilities, you can have a lot of money if you don't manage it properly. If you take risky loans that you don't have the collateral to underwrite it. So yes, it is part of resources, part of capabilities, but part is the operative word. Leadership, management. Yes, sir?
Back to the rate of request. We said neither yay or nay. We made a decision to not respond. You listed 6 or so consequential factors, including SGU, tourism, the economy, CBI. It's a done deal. What's the likely consequences for Grenada?
There are known knowns, and there are known unknowns. There are also unknown unknowns. I couldn't tell you. It may be that the consequences in relation to the decision that came out of a non-decision has to do with something else other than those 6 areas I mentioned there. I would argue that those 6 areas are not the only possible areas of vulnerability. Known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns. Desmond? Let the president go first. She stood up before, and I omitted to acknowledge her.
But you mentioned budget. I have to go home so I can do budget tomorrow. So that's my excuse for going before Wendy.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming to Grenada. And thanks for telling everybody in Grenada that we used to go dancing. I think that there was such a small group of Caribbean, academicians or intellectuals, pressing forward with our future, that we really embraced each other in a way that's paying off now that the relationships are still in place. Right. So I think it was really a wonderful experience to encounter intellectuals or Caribbean people, abroad in the same enterprise. So thanks for you having carried it forward so gallantly. Right. There is a Guyanese writer, one of somebody that I'm sure you know, Lyndon Lewis, who's been writing quite a bit, and one of his very powerful articles is on the epistemology of the Caribbean personhood, the mind, the psychic, the formation of the Caribbean. What makes us Caribbean? Why we say we're not African, we're not American, we're not. And he argues that part of that is because we have inherited a propensity for survival through resistance. He pins it onto slavery. Having come through slavery, we therefore are always aiming for that survival, that success. And when I first read it, it hit me like a lightning bolt because it helped me understand sort of the motive, the energy of the Caribbean person. For example, with migration, we migrate because we want to better ourselves. We always, you have to do well in school and so on. And I think this is the underpinning for me of the question you put on the table is, whither do we go as a region now from here? And you said you're not pessimistic, but it's a very sad, I can't remember the word, but you're not pessimistic, but it's a difficult moment. I still read it as being pessimistic, as being troubled and troubling. And I reject that. I think that the Caribbean psychic is eternally optimistic. Some people say it's eternally carnival. You know, it's always gay and celebrating and so on. Not sure about that, but I am absolutely sure in my soul that the Caribbean psychic is one of survival and strength and endurance and going forward. Therefore, in this dispensation, you helped me tonight understand something that I'd been grappling with. I believe in that optimistic vein, that we are being lifted. The Caribbean is not falling behind, whatever the statistics are. Yes, this economy is poor, this crime is high, and so on. But overall, the region is maturing and going forward. And what helped me is to crystallize that we have linked our boat, knowingly or unknowingly, and I believe more knowingly, to the BRICS. Now, I spent a good part of my diplomatic career following the BRICS around the world, getting them to adopt the SIDS as their junior partner. And it was a difficult proposition, whether it was Brazil or South Africa or China. They weren't paying attention to the SIDS. Now they are. Now they are wooing us. The BRICS are wooing the Caribbean SIDS. The Europeans are wooing every SID that they can. The Africans are partnering with the SIDS. The Caribbean has succeeded at something or some things and is poised for more. And I think that is a message of all that I've heard, all that we're engaged in. And I'd like to talk about, you know, the link between vulnerability and challenge, sovereignty. Which comes first? You know, is our sovereignty more challenged because we are so vulnerable? Or is it our vulnerability that creates that challenge to our sovereignty? I mean, we can argue it both ways. And I think you're right. You're absolutely right on ending with the Morris Bishop understanding of our sovereignty. That in fact, we said in Grenada, it is challenged, but we will not give way to taking it away from us. That was part of the big message of the Grenada Revolution. And I think we are in a better position now, radar or not, to argue that. And in fact, I mean, it's a bit early, but I think we in Grenada feel, look, you know, and I'll say it, we feel we've won again. We feel we've won again because to date, we have averted the radar coming, which is, as you said correctly, it's an emotional, practical, financial, security, and logistical issue for us to have a radar put up on the Morris Bishop Airport. And I think that we don't know what the future holds, the known unknowns and so on are still out there. But at this moment, in this juncture, we have won. We have won. And we feel that. It doesn't mean we are invincible. It doesn't mean, you know, worse may not come. Yes, we're still vulnerable. But we have made a stance for ourselves and in the world again. And I think I take that. So I didn't want to leave us feeling that we cannot. We can, even though we don't get all of it. And we are succeeding, and we are being pursued. And the last thing I want to say, I have about 6 points I had in my mind to say, but I won't. I just made that one. The zone of peace issue had 3 components to it. It came on the stage in the Caribbean in 1972. And in 1979, the Grenada Revolution sent a young diplomat to go and campaign this idea across Latin America, essentially. And the idea was that the Caribbean should be a zone of peace, a zone of independence, and a zone of development. And therefore, when Prime Minister Pamela Prasad calls for the focus on domestic peace, away from crime and criminality, to secure the region rather than being worried about cooperating with military or security requests. I think she's tapping into one of the three pillars of the zone of peace, which had become sort of silent or dormant, which is development. And I would argue that it really is more possible to secure that domestic peace if we have external peace for us as small states. So it's not either or, and it certainly is not necessary for us to secure peace at home cannot be accomplished in the absence of regional or international peace. So it doesn't. So she's straddling that fence in an interesting. And I have other thoughts, but
okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Let me make three quick observations on Madam President of the Senate's thoughtful commentary. The first is to say that for me there's a symbiosis between vulnerability and sovereignty. It's not which comes first, they're connected. They reinforce each other. The weakening of either diminishes both. Similarly, there's a symbiosis between the internal development and the peace regionally, internal development and peace domestically. Absolutely agree with you. I consider myself to be pragmatic. And I want to share with you how I end this book that you will buy a copy of, you will buy a copy of, you will buy a copy of. I end this book with a poem. I end this book by a poem written in 1919 by a Jamaican poet. He was not writing about the Caribbean. He was writing about the condition of black folk in the United States. And he wanted a message of hope and hopefulness, a message that resonates with resilience. And I say in this book, we've got some bleak realities in regard to crime, drugs, cybercrime, but we cannot be fatalistic and give up hope. So I went back to Claude McKay, one of the architects of the Harlem Renaissance. This is what Claude McKay said, 1919. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock of our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us die nobly, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us through dead. O kinsmen, said Claude McKay, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us be brave. And for the 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. I end this book because I make the point here is we don't have any recourse but fighting back. We can just be playing dead and see what's going to happen. So yes, situation bad. There was a certain Guyanese guy who talked about, Lily and Dad might remember the situation, chaotic. Not just chaotic, chaotic is so bad. Situation may be chaotic, but we do not have the luxury of not standing up and fighting back. Here's my final point. One of the things I did in Trinidad, she and I had some lunches and dinners, breakfast with some friends we hadn't seen for a while, military and diplomatic. And then I met with another scholar, young scholar, commiserating about some of our challenges. I reminded her of something that the Chinese philosopher Confucius said. He said, our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Confucius. Our greatest glory is not in never fall. We're going to fall, but we have to rise. We stand a greater prospect of rising if we hold hands. My worry is that so many of us are not willing to hold hands. Buy this book, read Claude McKay's book.
Okay, so after this question, we'll take our final question from Dr. Paul and then wrap up this evening's proceedings.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I go ahead? Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Griffith, for a well-researched and presented, for the very lively discussion that we're having. I just want to follow
Excuse me, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we have a request for the driver of PW57 to please move your vehicle. PW57. Don't be ashamed.
Not in here.
Okay, that's PW57. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Okay. Wow, I've had it for the night. I just want to follow through, though, with what our president said, and to, continue. It may not be a question ultimately, but to make a comment.
Sure.
Now, I listened to the entire context in which you presented your conclusion, and I sort of, at the end, felt as if you were trying to convey to us that we are not in a position to say no to the request for a reader. I'm not sure, I hope I did not misunderstand the context in which you presented, but I got that strong feeling, and hopefully I hope not. But I'm saying that while we are here intellectualizing the whole issue, I'm thinking more so of the average Grenadian, who would have, I can speak from my own experience. I have been a child of the revolution. So I had 4.5 years of political education, knowledge of international relations, a deep understanding of colonialism and imperialism. So when we heard about the request, as a request for fight against drug and narco-terrorism, etc., immediately that was dismissed in my mind, and I'm sure in many Grenadians who would have gone through the experiences of the revolution and the invasion. And so I think, as I think of our own people, I find it difficult to understand the silence. I'm not sure if it's fair, but I'm getting a sense of silence that is not a silence where people surrender, but a sort of silence that could possibly be leaning on fear to say a loud no. I understand from the political point of view and the diplomatic point of view, and I think it was brilliance on the part of our government in the way they would have approached the whole radar issue. But for the common Grenadian who would have experienced the invasion and who would have experienced all the bombs falling on our head, and understanding that since the collapse since the invasion, the United States removed themselves from this region, and all of the countries who you said assisted with the invasion, got nothing from the United States. And for us, it is not the material stuff, but it's a spirit, and I think that is very prominent among Grenadians. It's a spirit that the revolution has instilled in us that continue to exist in us. It's a resistance that we do have about things like these. So when many civic organizations, and if you look at the responses of the Grenada community, people have been loudly saying no. And so I can understand if the no comes from the average person out there, because we know the experience. We have experienced war, and we do not want to experience that again. So when we see all these battleships in our region, of course it will create fear, because we are still traumatized 4 decades later. And so other Caribbean governments and people need to understand, when we take a position and say loudly no, that it is coming from an experience in history that affords us that right to say no.
Good, thanks for the comment. I'll just make 2 quick observations before I turn it back over to the moderator. I agree with you entirely. I was not trying to say what Grenada should do. I was showing you the principle versus pragmatism, considerations that I suspect the prudent leadership of your nation would want to be mindful of, and you want to keep in mind. One of the things that Dr. Grenada did yesterday, great, on the webinar we had, she laid out what was the case for people who support the radar and people who oppose it. But let me say this, and this is the pragmatism, and this is my devil's advocate commentary. Ask some of those same people who say no about their visa request to go to the United States and hear what they say. Ask some of those people who say no about whether they're involved in the fishing industry. United States said to Grenada, as well as other countries, you've got to do something differently if we're going to allow you to export fish to us. Those same fishermen who say no want to sell their fish, so they've got to have a pragmatic aspect to them. I'm simply saying to you that emotion cannot rule the day all the time. You've got to have consideration of the pragmatic. Some of those ministers whose visas are on the verge of being taken away, or have been, I don't think you're on the list, so I say. The Attorney General is not on the list, I'm told. So, but what I'm trying to make is that the average man in the street sometimes doesn't have the responsibility to factor things other than emotion into the matrix. That same person may not see the contradiction of saying, we don't want America, but I want a visa to go there. I have a brother who won't come home. He may not be straight, and he can't come because pragmatism and principle. The leadership always have got to balance them. But I wasn't trying to say whether you should say yea or nay. If anybody said, Professor Griffith says so, tell him it wasn't me.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So we're at the end of our question and answer segment. I would like to invite Mr. Farrakhan to deliver our vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Allow me to adopt the protocol already established earlier today And on behalf of the Grenada Bar Association, it is both a privilege and an honor to deliver the vote of thanks on this significant occasion, the 21st Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture. First and foremost, we pause for a quick moment to give thanks to Almighty God. It is by His grace that we are granted the opportunity to gather once again, and may His continued guidance inspire the work we do, both individually and collectively, as we honor the legacy of Sir Archibald NEDD and uphold the principles that he's championed. This evening, we were privileged to hear from our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Griffith. Professor, your presentation was not only intellectually stimulating, but deeply enriching. You engaged us with clarity, depth, and scholarship, and your reflections have added meaningful insights to the discourse that surrounds this annual lecture. You enlightened us on many pertinent points, a few of which are the relevant global and local contextual factors, some of the contemporary geopolitical realities that dramatize Grenada's vulnerability, and some of the region-wide implications and ironies of this extant saga, just to pinpoint a few. Professor, for your time, your thoughtful preparation, and the wisdom you have shared, we express our profound gratitude. We also extend heartfelt appreciation to our sponsors whose significant support made this 21st Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture a success, and in the continued years to come. To our title and platinum sponsor, ACB Grenada Bank, who have eagerly joined us this year, thank you for your unwavering commitment to the advancement of education, dialogue, and professional development within our legal and wider community. Your partnership is invaluable, and we tremendously appreciate and are hopeful for your continued investment in this memorial lecture. To our gold sponsor, IMA Grenada, we are sincerely grateful for your contribution and generosity. Your support plays a vital role in ensuring that we can host an event of this caliber, one that honors our past while inspiring our future. To our fellow members of the Grenada Bar Association, thank you for your dedication, your participation, and your ongoing support of this important tradition. Your presence here reflects the unity and professionalism that define our association. A special word of gratitude goes to Ms. Brittany Scott, whose creativity and attention to detail have not gone unnoticed in the production of the exceptional work on graphic designs for this year's lecture, which significantly enhanced the presentation and promotion of this event. We also acknowledge with deep appreciation Ms. Shamara Cherubin Forsyth for her invaluable support to the Bar Executive. Shamara, your organization and commitment behind the scenes lent to the seamless preparation and smooth execution of this evening's program. Lastly, to each and every one of you, our attendees, whether you're joining us in this space or virtually, thank you for your time, your engagement, and your continued support of this Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture. Your participation keeps this tradition alive and ensures that the values and contributions of Sir Archibald NEDD remain a guiding light for generations to come. Thank you to all, and do have a wonderful rest of your evening.
On that note of gratitude, I invite Mr. Deloney Edwards for our token of appreciation. And with him, Ms. Aisha McLean.
Good night, everyone. Professor, if you could just come to the front. On behalf of Grenada and the Grenada Bar Association, we present you with a token of appreciation for your wonderful lecture tonight and your inspiring words. And we thank you, and we hope to see you again in Grenada. A round of applause again, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. But let me say the following before Ms. McLean goes too far. I mentioned Mr. Ruggles Ferguson at the beginning in appreciation for his role historically and the contemporary with this lecture. But I want to express appreciation tangibly to two other individuals, and I want to invite the president of the Bar Association to receive as an appreciation, as a token of my appreciation, a copy of the book that he will buy 15 copies of for members of his executive. Thanks for everything you did, Francis.
You're welcome, Professor. My pleasure.
Quite indefatigable in her preparation was the secretary. So Aisha, would you come and receive? My most recent book is Oil and Climate Change in Guyana's Wet Neighborhood, Probing Promise and Potential Peril. Delighted to give you a copy of this book.
So we have come to the end of tonight's proceedings, the 21st Sir Archibald NEDD Memorial Lecture. On behalf of the Grenada Bar Association, we thank each of you for your attendance and engagement. May tonight's discussion inspire continued thought and meaningful action as we navigate the challenges and opportunities in our region. To have a safe and pleasant evening, and of course, just keeping in mind that this is our law week, we have some attorneys amongst us, so members of the public, if you'd like to get any further information about law week, what is our next step in terms of the plans for the rest of the week, feel free to ask any one of the attorneys. Thank you very much and do have a good night.